So thanks for checking this video out. Basically today I'm gonna talk to you about an idea I've had for a new subreddit, a new Star Wars subreddit called Thank the Maker. And I'm going to talk to you about what the idea behind it is, why I think it should be able to grow and maybe get a bit more traction. And hopefully I'll explain it to you in a way that sounds interesting, and maybe you'll consider contributing to it. So Thank the Maker is a new Star Wars subreddit dedicated to that original George Lucas era of Star Wars. So I'm obviously talking about episodes 1 to 6 there, but also everything that came with episodes 1 to 6. All the video games, the expanded universe, the Clone Wars, for example. So that original George Lucas era, sort of from the 1970s when he was making the first film, up until when he sold it to Disney in 2012. And strangely, I don't actually think there's a subreddit dedicated to that. There's Star Wars subreddits, of course, and you've got things specifically focused on the prequel trilogy that obviously talk a lot about George Lucas. You've got things specifically focused on the expanded universe, and you've got things specifically focused on the sequels and criticizing the sequels, which might inevitably lead to discussing Lucas. And whilst I think that's useful to discuss the prequel trilogy individually and trilogies individually, I also think now that we're sort of in the post-Lucas era, I think it's useful to think of his creation as one whole. So everything that he created, especially the 6 movies he made. And that there isn't really a subreddit dedicated to that. So that's what I'm trying to create here. But of course, I don't want us to only talk about the original era. It's fine if you want to use this subreddit to do that, to only talk about the original trilogy, the PT, or the whole George Lucas era. But I also think it would be really interesting to talk about the Disney era in light of the Lucas one, to draw comparisons. And I recognise that probably most of the people who want to draw comparisons between the two eras of Star Wars are maybe going to do it in order to criticise Disney. But I don't think this place has to only be an anti-Disney zone. I think there are actually some positive connections you can draw between the Lucas era and the Disney era. For the sequel trilogy in The Mandalorian, for example, there are some things to be said there. And you might think there are plenty of things to be said. You might think that the sequel trilogy draws upon the prequel trilogy and the original trilogy perfectly. You might think that it doesn't. And I'd love you to put your opinion forward here in an interesting way. There's sort of those two strands to this subreddit. The original era of Star Wars and talking about the new era in light of the old. How does it draw upon it? How does it diverge from it? Do they fit together well? That's the central idea I've had in terms of why I created this subreddit. So I've sort of defined the rules there as that posts must relate to that original era or the comparison between the eras. But I don't want that to sound too rigid or inflexible. The rule is meant to be kind of loose. You don't have to always talk about George Lucas or always talk about the 6 Star Wars movies he created. It's meant to be pretty flexible there, and I don't want to be a dogmatic moderator. I want people to discuss Star Wars in their own way, but of course I don't want it to infringe on the other communities, which are great places to already do that. So I sort of thought about the 5 principles of this community. What is it really there to do? So I've mentioned that it's just to discuss Lucas's creation as a whole, everything that he made, the empire he sort of built. And I think one of the real justifications for this subreddit is that fan opinions about Lucas and his movies have been so changeable, and they still change today, especially in light of the Disney era. So that's really interesting. Like, has your opinion about the movies changed? Does it differ from trilogy to trilogy? What is your opinion of Lucas's work collectively? What is your opinion of him as a filmmaker? You know, comparing him to his other work. I know Star Wars dominated his career, but there are loads of comparisons to be drawn between his other movies, such as American Graffiti and THX. But because those fan opinions change so much over time, I think it's really great to talk about, you know, what you think, and also talk literally about how your opinions of Star Wars have changed for the good or bad. And yeah, I mentioned I think there should be a place where we talk also in detail about Lucas as a filmmaker. And I think that's what probably is the most defining feature of the Lucas era of Star Wars, is that he has a very specific approach as a filmmaker, whether that be in the way he shoots the films, or the messages he tries to put across, or the way he deals with things such as how the films reference each other, or whether old characters come up in new movies, or whether they don't do that, whether he introduces new characters. He has a very specific way of doing things. And of course, there are various things that influenced him. You know, old westerns, Kurosawa, I'd like those to be discussed here as well. And I think that's especially important as other people pick up the mantle and go to create Star Wars movies, such as Dave Filoni creating new TV shows as well. Other, you know, new people are in charge of the merchandising, the action figures, something that George Lucas would always be heavily involved in. He's now not so much, and other people will do it differently, and they may be trying to honour Lucas in doing that, and I think it's important that we discuss what we think of that. And other complete newcomers such as Taika Waititi. Filoni's very connected to Lucas, but the likes of Waititi, who's got his own new film to make, it will be really interesting to see what he thinks of Star Wars. It'll be really interesting to compare how Star Wars has changed when he finally makes his movie. So, you know, their style as a filmmaker will be different, but also their philosophy in terms of what is Star Wars, what's the meaning of it, should it go deeper, should it be nostalgic, should it be surface level spaceship battles, or should there be something beneath it? What are the messages they're trying to convey, and do they match what George Lucas initially conceived, or do they, you know, make it even better perhaps? So yeah, it's there as well to discuss Disney's treatment of it in both a negative and positive way, because there will be instances, and there already has been instances, where Disney has positively built upon what Lucas made, and of course there are instances where they've not done such a good job. But you don't have to agree with that. I want to hear what you think about that comparison. And perhaps the most important thing is to highlight how Lucas, directly or indirectly, still influences Star Wars. He's created Star Wars, so he inevitably will always have some sort of relevance to it, even if in 50 years somebody completely disconnected from him is making Star Wars movies. There'll still be something relevant to say about the comparison between that person and George Lucas. But also more directly, George Lucas still has a role in Star Wars. He's still attending the set of The Mandalorian, you know, influencing Filoni and Favreau, and that's really interesting to see. And he might even have a more prominent role in the future. Who knows? He might get to make his sequel trilogy. He might get to, you know, have a greater role on a Star Wars TV show, or we might get to see what his ideas for the sequel trilogy were, and that will be really interesting to discuss. So yeah, I think there's some really interesting things to be said about the more external things, that like the hidden messages in Star Wars, what influenced Star Wars, likes of Kurosawa. There's a really interesting bit in Disney Gallery's Mandalorian series on Disney Plus, where Favreau talks about how they wanted the Mandalorian to be influenced by the stuff that influenced George. So, not parodying Star Wars, so to speak, not just simply looking at old Star Wars movies and making new ones, but by looking at what influenced George Lucas when he was coming up with Star Wars. And I think that's a great way to come up with a much more authentic, original approach. And another reason I think it's important to talk about Lucas specifically is because he himself, not just the fans, but he himself has had a changing relationship with Star Wars. You know, there have been times where he seems disconnected from it, like he doesn't like it, like it was just some movies to him and he wants to move on and do another project. Or there are times where he's clearly very passionate about it. So he's had a change in relationship, and that's something that will continue to be interesting. So yeah, that's generally my overview of what I want this subreddit to be and how I think you might be able to contribute to it. But to be honest, it's not got off to the best start. I'm pretty much the only person who's contributed to it. I'm really grateful for the one or two of us that have contributed. But obviously, I'm making this video because I want to see if it can become something more popular. Because I'd love to see how other people view Lucas's legacy and how they see Star Wars today and how they see that original era of it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this subreddit and how you think it can be improved, whether it's the rules specifically or the flair or the actual intentions of the subreddit, or if it's just something about the background or the design. I've sort of gone for this cover photo here because I think it's 3 connected and significant moments from George Lucas's Star Wars saga. So you've got Luke starting his journey, and then the confrontation. So A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back really sums up those titles there, and then the Jedi Returns next to his father in the prequel trilogy. I love the scene where Anakin's standing before the Jedi Council. I think it's great for world building and redefining what Star Wars was at the time, and adding a lot of context that people must have been wondering about after the original trilogy. This is just a great scene where Anakin goes off to find his mother. Probably really sums up George Lucas's intentions. So he says for it to be a visual cinematic experience, where what you're looking at is more important than what you're hearing or the acting, for example. And then the Darth Plagueis scene is where Anakin turns, or where it's a significant moment, a pivotal moment in him turning. So you can see the journey there in those 6 photos, I think. So yeah, I'd love to hear what you think of this, and I'd also love to see you contribute in your own way. I won't be a stubborn moderator. There are other Star Wars communities that cover a lot of things, but I think the niche here is the original era of Star Wars as a whole to be discussed. You don't have to specifically mention George Lucas or the era in your posts, but it just sort of has to be maybe the inspiration behind your post. I think the ideal post is something that talks about those specific issues, about George Lucas or his cinematic approach or the comparisons or the meaning of Star Wars, or for example this post here about how the music has evolved in The Mandalorian. But I'm not opposed to the more generic posts, like one I did about just how just about a simple Star Wars post about the original trilogy. Here's a shot of Luke Skywalker behind the scenes and Mark Hamill. That's great as well. It's good to have a balance of that in a subreddit. So Yeah, let me know what you think. Please go ahead and join the subreddit and share something that you like about George Lucas, Star Wars, the Disney era in relation to it, or a criticism. Go for it. Thank you.